Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to day 4, part 4 of the August webinar series about setting up a company in China. We have been reflecting on the last 3 days about the key decisions that have to be made prior to actually submitting those documents to incorporate the company in China. As such, we've been focusing on really what are the most critical decisions that have to be made. On Monday, I provided an overview of the 9 key considerations that have to, or decisions that actually have to be made prior to the incorporation. On Tuesday, I was reflecting on registered capital, the actual working capital that's going to initialize the company in China. Yesterday, we were looking at, what were we actually looking at? We were looking at I've lost my train of thought. We were looking at the registered office address locations. And today, so because location is really critical to the business, and today we're going to be looking at who you're going to actually appoint within the corporate management of the company. So let's get cracking. There are not so many people attending today, and those that I do know that are attending, I do know. So if you are watching this on replay up on our YouTube channel, then please do let me know. Are you a newbie to China? Are you a startup to China? Or are you an experienced China hand? You can just put that into the comments section. How the webinar works is we are using Zoom meetings. If I run into any technical issues, it does take about a minute to a minute and a half for me to reboot the system. It's usually because of my Wi-Fi. And if you run into any difficulties, just know that you can log off, log back onto the system using your URL. If the problems persist, just know we are recording today's session and it'll be up on the YouTube channel in any case. If you do have any questions during the Q&A, or if you do watch this on replay and you have any questions, I will provide my contact details at the end, but don't forget you can always reach out and ask in any case. Just a little bit about myself. I'm the expert for this week, and my name is Christina. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I've got 17 years of on-the-ground experience in corporate services and compliance in China, based out of Shanghai. 100% of my clients are foreign investors that are investing and opening up subsidiaries in Hong Kong as well as in China. What we do is we help clients provide a one-stop solution in terms of the pre-investment advisory, which entails everything from business model creation to understanding the financial resources that are required, understanding HR issues, all the way to implementing those structures. And then the fun part of the job is really focusing on scaling up and growing that business. One of the beautiful things that we've seen in China over the last 17 years is how the government has gone from doing things in a not processed way to actually creating systems and methodologies that are standardized. So we've been able to create methodologies explaining how things work in China to foreign investors. And you can go up on our YouTube channel and you'll find all of our videos about these methodologies there. And if you're interested in reading something, a little bit about China. One of the things that I've noticed about books that are on China is that they get outdated very quickly. I didn't want to write a book in 2020 that would get outdated. I really wanted to write a book about the principles of doing business in China that I should have learned when I first arrived in 2003 and that are still valid today. For me, there are 9 superpowers, 9 principles that you need to know to really succeed in China. My belief is that everyone has to create a sound foundation, a solid foundation in China. And these principles are there to create that solid foundation that you can then scale up and grow and not reflect back and take steps back that can prevent you from growing at the speed that you wish. So it really highlights the tools you need to create your own journey and to create that solid foundation. It's on Amazon, on all of various Amazons. Platforms in Kindle and hard copy version. So let's get cracking on part 4 today, which is really how to choose the right people for your corporate management in China. And what we're covering today is a couple of case studies of what not to do. We're going to look at the shareholder, who's part of the corporate management. We're going to look at the corporate structure in China. What options do you have? we're going to look at the roles and responsibilities of the positions in the corporate structure, how you can allocate power, and then action plans that you can use to take away. So setting up a company in China, what roles are in the corporate management? So your action plan is basically figuring out who to appoint for these various roles. So one is the shareholder. Specifically, is that going to be an individual? Is it going to be a company? And who's going to be the authorized signatory signing on behalf of the shareholder? Are you going to set up a board of directors or an executive director? Who's going to be the legal rep? Who's going to be the GM? And who's going to be the supervisor? A lot of these terminologies don't exist in the Western world. So that's why we'll be going into details about what do the roles and responsibilities mean. Now, what I see, and what is actually the biggest pain point, is that there is a fear from individuals, from the foreign investors, to hold these positions in the China business. And the fear is just, what is China going to do if something happens? What's going to happen to me? What risks are there? I don't want to get into trouble. I'm just an employee. I don't have any stakeholdership in the parent company. So there's a certain level of fear and questions that are raised about holding any of these positions. All right. But ultimately, what I want to highlight today is that if you hold director level positions, C-level positions, senior managerial positions in the US, in the UK, in Germany, in France, you're going to have the same type of liabilities if you're going to hold them in China. Don't make an assumption that just because it's China, that there are more risks and responsibilities. As long as your company is not doing anything criminal, you're fine. Just like if your company in the UK, US, Germany, wherever was not doing something criminal, you'd also be fine. Okay, so let's take a step back first and realize that whether you have a company in China or anywhere else in the world holding certain legal positions or corporate management positions, you'll have the same liabilities and risks. Okay, so what you want to be able to implement, more importantly than who's going to hold these positions, is actual corporate governance in your company to make sure that company is not doing anything illegal. Okay, you want to make sure the accounts are done well. You want to make sure that the chops are being used properly. You want to make sure that literally the internal governance of your company is above board. Okay, if you don't pay attention to that, then you're leaving yourself open to employees doing something illegal, which obviously will impact you holding these corporate management positions, as it would be the case in any other Western jurisdiction. Okay, so that's really the conclusion. I'm starting off with the conclusion, everyone. The conclusion from today's presentation is don't have fear about holding those positions. Have fear if you don't incorporate corporate governance into your company. Okay, so who should be the shareholder? And the biggest question, as I highlighted on Monday, was, is it going to be an individual? Is it going to be a company? Individual means, is it going to be just an individual foreign investor? Or is it going to be a foreign company that's already established in the US, UK, Germany, France, wherever it might be? There's no pros and cons to this. I would just say, create tax simulations for a variety of different scenarios on what would be a better option for you. So, if you intend to add investors, if you intend to sell the company in the future, if you want to receive dividends, if you want to repatriate funds, where would it go and what would be the tax liabilities on that? So creating tax simulations around the various scenarios will help and guide you to answer this question of whether it should be an individual versus a company. On a separate note, just from a, fear perspective again, is, I personally would not want to hold a company in China because if I don't have the corporate governance or I haven't thought about everything, I don't think I would want individually to be attacked. I'd rather have a company that is acting as the intermediary to handle all of those legal issues. That's just a personal point of view. Everybody might be a little bit different in terms of how they see that. When you're considering who the shareholder might be, you've got to consider whether you're going to have an offshore holding company. And it would be wrong of me if I didn't include this slide here today. Offshore holding companies used to be the go-to for establishing subsidiaries in China. with the revolution or evolution, I guess, of double taxation agreements globally with China, offshore holding companies have become less important because you're getting the same tax incentives as whether you use a Hong Kong company to a UK company, to a Singapore company, to a Seychelles company, to a BVI company, etc. So if you are considering offshore holding companies, there are three things I would look at: is the double taxation agreements. Does it make sense? Will those offshore holding companies ever be operational? Because if they don't have commercial economic substance, they may be excluded from the double taxation agreements. Looking at indirect transfer of assets, and then also looking at the place of effective management. So if there is no effective management in that offshore holding company, and it's actually in your head office in the UK, then, you know, if there's an investigation on that, you can't benefit from the double taxation agreements either. One item I didn't add here is cost. The costs of having an offshore holding company. Why have you decided to take that route? If it is for a tax perspective, then just think, when is China actually going to repatriate funds to that offshore holding company? It will never happen overnight. It will take years before that actually happens. So does it make sense in those years where you're waiting to manage and operate an offshore holding company and pay for it on an annual basis without being of real use to you? Money is like gold now. I mean, with COVID and the pandemic, everyone is really careful on budgets. So you've got to really analyze whether this type of structure is going to be suitable for your business and that you can afford it. Hong Kong has always been known as the gateway to China. Historically, it's always been the landing point for people to think about getting into the Chinese market. Is Hong Kong still the gateway to China? Definitely less so. It might be more of a gateway to the Greater Bay Area than it is to China as a whole. And again, it's something where I would highly recommend people analyze whether having a Hong Kong company makes sense or not. My philosophy is this: if China is not your only market in Asia, but you're looking to expand into other Asian countries like Australia, Taiwan, Japan, Vietnam, all of these Southeast Asian countries, as well as Asian countries, as well as China. And yeah, setting up a Hong Kong company as a Asian regional hub completely makes sense, because you'll be developing economic and commercial substance through the trade transactions that occur or service transactions that occur. But if you're thinking much smaller scale, that China is the only market, my question back to you would be, why spend that money on a Hong Kong company? So let's look at a bit of case studies around the corporate management where I can thoroughly show you that no thought has gone into appointing people in these roles, or no backup has been made. Okay, so case study one is a high turnover of corporate management. And what this means basically is that an SME in Canada incorporated their subsidiary in Shanghai. And within the first 2 years of operation, they spent over 80,000 RMB in legal fees in order to change the internal corporate structure. Why did this happen? Because there were continuous resignations in C-level roles in the head office. And many of these people had held the roles in the China company. Now, when you are appointing people in the corporate management, if anybody is resigning from the organization, they need to be replaced immediately. And you cannot leave that role empty. When you do a replacement in China and you file for that application, you already need to have the person who's taking over appointed in that role. And it has to be done immediately because there are banking issues around it. There are signatory issues that have to be thought about. So you cannot just wait to remove someone. Also, if someone has resigned and is no longer working for that company, they need to be removed from a liability perspective as well, because you don't know what they're doing in a new company, but also for their benefit, they don't know what you're doing with the Chinese company. So it is important to do that replacement straight away. And again, spending 80,000 RMB out of your budget for professional fees when you are just starting up your business in the first 2 years of operation, that's not money you want to spend on legal fees, because that should be done and dusted. So think about maybe having a simple corporate management structure where you have maybe minimum of 2 people appointed that are stable within the organization before you start adding a larger group of individuals where there could be instability in their employment. Case study 2 is the termination of individuals in the corporate management structure. So this is the case study of an SME in Italy establishing, again, their subsidiary in Shanghai. They had it for a number of years, so over 10, I want to say 8-10 years. And they had a legal representative who was Italian, having relocated to China, and was also the acting general manager. Now, literally overnight, they terminated this Italian, forgetting, again, the corporate governance issues around corporate management structures, and forgetting that he needed to be replaced. And this impacted the bank account, and this impacted further changes they wanted to make in the actual corporate structure of the company. So at the point where they wanted to make these changes with the bank and whatnot, they realized that they had to go through an application procedure to replace this Italian guy who was the acting legal rep and GM to somebody else. And one thing that, again, they forgot, because we're talking about 8-10 years down the line, was that they needed a document signed by this individual to say that he had officially resigned. And this document was pertinent to the application. But because the termination had been ugly, this individual refused to sign anything, which made it very difficult to process the application. So one thing was thinking outside of the box and just saying, well, this person had died. But the government is clever. They asked to see a death certificate to prove that he had passed away. Now, we're always trying to think of loopholes and try to get things done. But the Chinese government is not stupid. They will be checking things. They will be wanting to verify things. So it is important anytime you're looking to do a corporate management change, don't do things on your own. Get advice first, because also something to think about is that, this company was established, and this happened 8-10 years after the establishment, where regulations would have changed, procedures would have changed, processes would have changed. So getting updated before you take any form of action is important, to just prepare yourself for any of the ugliness that might appear. So, if they would have contacted a provider prior to this saying, we want to terminate our legal rep, our GM, what does it mean for the company? What would we need to get from him? That's critical. All right. Just another story, somebody also terminated a GM, a chief representative in Beijing back in the day. They did it over the phone, so not even in person. And as a retaliation, this chief rep, as a leverage tool, basically said that they were going to keep all of the company documents, certificates, chops, meaning that the company couldn't operate anymore. So be very careful when you are terminating. Case study 3 is about no replacement available for individuals that are within the corporate management. So this was a SME that was incorporated in the US, and apologies, everybody. I've got my children at home. What do you need? Oh, I'm on a webinar. You see that, right? Can't. Please close the door. Thank you. Sorry for that, everybody. So this was a US company that also had their incorporation done in Shanghai, and they had a legal representative who was the head of Asia Pacific operations. So logical choice that he be designated, but as would be, he resigned. And in this situation, for a year and a half, he was still kept as a legal representative of this China subsidiary because the company could not decide or find a replacement for him. Now, what happened is that this individual kept following up saying, please remove me, please remove me. I don't know what's going on in your China company, and I don't want to have that type of responsibility. That it took a year and a half, but finally he took a lawyer to threaten suing if they wouldn't change his name out of the documents, because his name was actually written on the business license. Now, in this case, he was a smart guy because, again, he just didn't know what they were doing in China, and he didn't want to take any of that responsibility. And so he took initiative, and he hired a lawyer to get involved in that. And it was the company's responsibility to find that replacement sooner. I mean, you have to imagine a year and a half, 18 months listed on somebody else's company's business license. And for him, it was a big concern because his new role within his new organization was also head of Asia Pacific operations. And his biggest fear was that he was going to go through a border in China and have his name blacklisted because something his previous company had done. How embarrassing would that have been for him with his new company? So he wanted to make sure that everything was, you know, again, above board, that there was proper corporate governance and that he had no liability. So it is, as I mentioned earlier, really important to have replacements available and backups available. Now let's look at the corporate management structure in China. Okay, so you've got basically two options available to you. The difference between the left and the right is the board of directors on the left and executive director on the right. Okay, so ultimately you've got a shareholder. The shareholder appoints either a board of directors or an executive director. Board of directors has to have a minimum of 3 people. An executive director is 1 person. That's the difference between these two structures. Then you've got the shareholder appointing the legal rep, who normally would be the chairman of the board, who might also be the executive director. And then you have a general manager who could also be the chairman of the board, could also be the executive director, or could be somebody else. And then separate from that, the shareholders appointing the supervisor. And I'll explain what these roles mean, what the responsibilities are. But these are the two options that you have. What you have to think logically is that on the left side, when you have a board of directors, you are ultimately looking for 4 people to be appointed, because you need a minimum of 3 people in the board. Chairman will be legal rep GM. And then you have a 4th person who's the supervisor. Supervisor cannot fulfill any of the other roles of board of director, legal rep GM. Whereas on the right side, the executive director, legal rep GM can be 1 person, and then you have a 2nd person who's the supervisor. So ultimately, you're looking for 4 people on the left to be appointed and 2 people on the right to be appointed. My feeling is always when you're a small, medium-sized company and you don't have a huge board in your own home jurisdiction, you know, think wisely about who you're appointing for these roles. You want to have stability. And I'll explain the criteria of these people as well, but you know, you want stability. You want people who are responsible for the China business. So you want, when I say responsible for China business, they know what's going on in the China business. They're involved in decisions. And you just want to simplify that structure, okay? So ultimately, you're analyzing as your action plan, like I highlighted on the first slide, is who's the shareholder going to be, and then who's going to be the authorized signatory. Are you going to choose a board of directors or an executive director, and who's going to be appointed? Who's going to be appointed as a legal rep, who's going to be appointed as a GM, and who's going to be appointed as a supervisor. Now let's look at the criteria of these individuals. Number 1, nobody needs to reside in China. So everybody could reside abroad, all right? They should be responsible for the China business. I would not recommend to pick people at random. Board of directors, by default, the chairman will be the legal rep, but it's not necessarily a must. It depends on the city where you're establishing the company. So in Shanghai, for example, the chairman of the board does not have to be the legal rep. A member of the board can be the legal rep. He can also be the GM. The executive director, option 2, can be the legal rep, can be the general manager, but the supervisor cannot fulfill any of those roles. Supervisor has to be somebody separated from that, okay? So that's the criteria, basically. Now let's look at the board responsibilities. And, you know, this is basically the responsibilities, the listed responsibilities. And I don't want to go through each item because it's pretty common sense, but I just want to highlight what's in red, basically, which is, you know, the board of directors or executive director are developing the corporate strategy, the company's investment plans. They're doing the annual financial budget plans, financial accounting plans. They're doing profit distribution plans, loss recovery plans. They're deciding on key issues surrounding the corporate structure of the company, including the increase and decrease of capital. They're making decisions on internal management departments, on corporate governance. They're going to appoint and dismiss the GM. And like I highlighted at the bottom, the basic rules and policies of the company, which is all associated with the corporate governance. Then you got the legal representative, okay? So the legal representative is the legal face to the company, all right? They are the individual that will be signing the majority of the documents when associated with the administration of the company. Okay. Now, the legal representative, and this is where a lot of people have fear of holding this role, may be sentenced with administrative sanctions or penalties. Okay. And obviously, if a true crime exists, then there will be a criminal responsibility as well. Okay. Now, what are they responsible for? Where they are responsible to make sure that the company is not doing any illegal operations beyond the range approved and registered by the authorities, i.e. your business scope. They will have criminal responsibility if they conceal facts from the tax authorities, registration authorities, or if they see that the company is practicing fraud. If they are secretly withdrawing funds or hiding property as well, then they will also have a certain level of criminal responsibility. So like I said earlier, the conclusion of this presentation is really to focus on the fact that corporate governance needs to be implemented within the company to make sure that it stays above board. Any form of illegal operation will, of course, be the responsibility of the board of directors as well as the legal representative, particularly the legal representative. The next is the responsibilities of the general manager. Okay, so again, nothing here is going to be out of the norm, right? So when you're talking about the responsibilities of the GM, it's looking at the business operations of the company, supervising that the company is actually operating, and executing all of the working plans that have been decided upon by the board of directors and the executive director. All right. And they are actually initializing and physically operating the business. The supervisor is somebody who is external, reporting to the shareholder. Now, this is a pretty obscure role, not really known in other Western countries. So why is there a supervisor? The supervisor is supposed to actually make sure that there is corporate governance within the company. And they are supposed to make sure that this corporate governance is implemented by the general manager, and that the company is operating legally within its scope of activities. So what are the responsibilities of the supervisor? Three main things that I've highlighted here is inspecting the financial affairs of the company to make sure they're above board. They're supervising the performance and duties of the directors, senior managers. They also will, if they see anything that is not appropriate, will ask for corrective action to be taken by the directors and the senior managers. Okay. They may have other powers of authority, but these are the three basic ones in terms of the idea of around the supervisor. So let's look at the power of authority, right? And allocating that power. Now, for me, you are setting up a brand new entity in China. A certain level of trust and loyalty needs to be built. Delegating power always requires a certain degree of trust, particularly if you are in Europe or the US or Canada or Australia and you're delegating that power to somebody locally. You have to trust them, right? Can't be somebody just off the street that you've hired. You need to develop some level of trust and loyalty. Now, even if you are in a desperate situation, which COVID has instilled on a lot of companies, that you have to instill trust from day one, otherwise you can't physically operate the company. There are still very simple measures that can be taken to mitigate the risks of placing that trust and that power to that individual, okay? What we want to try to do, again, is create corporate governance within the organization and mitigate the risk so that you are staying above board. Now, allocating power to the legal representative or allocating power to anybody that's appointed in the corporate management structure, or allocating power to just very simply a GM that has been hired. This all is representing this, okay? So what I want to highlight by allocating the power is basically by saying, think very clearly on who you're going to appoint. I would always ask for signed signature sheets that are undated for security purposes, like I highlighted about that Italian case study. If they had gotten undated signature sheets and kept it with a law firm so that in case of termination, they could have used those documents, with his signature already on, that would have been extremely helpful. Now, all of these things can be kept with lawyers, can be kept with corporate service providers, with tax agents, whomever you like. But to have these undated signature pages, although nobody would want to sign a blank piece of paper, again, by keeping it with a law firm that is neutral and who is working in the best interest of the company, is really important. Okay. Now, when appointing all of these roles, one thing that you have to clearly think about is limiting the powers of certain people. And you can do that within the articles of association of the company. You can also do that within management directives that can be created, which is all part of the corporate governance. And then it's really important that besides thinking about who you're appointing, is thinking about the day-to-day running of your business. Let's think logically. How is the operation of the business going to actually occur, right? And one simple question here is, for example, when you're just looking at the bank account, who are going to be the signatories? Who's going to have access to the bank accounts? Who is going to approve payments? How is that actually going to run and function on a day-to-day basis? And there are other areas of the business that you also have to think about. Let's say looking at contracts. Who is going to sign off on contracts? Who's going to approve contracts? Who's going to be doing the negotiation of the contracts, etc. Another is company chops, right? Now, company chops are critical to a business in China. They are bound by the chop that is on an agreement. Signatures are not valid. It's chops that make everything valid. And whoever holds these chops has a certain level of power as well. So who is going to hold those chops? Who is, again, from an operational perspective, it's understanding the types of chops that exist. So here I've listed the 6. Contract chop is less, number 3, the contract chop is less issued now because you can use the company chop for that. So usually it's around 5 chops that are issued, plus key tools, key tools that are used for tax, for bank. It's understanding who's going to keep all of these, who's going to operate these types of things. So I get that there's a fear in who's going to be appointed in these roles, but it's also really important to balance that with the physical day-to-day operation of the business in terms of, again, who's going to sign off on contracts, who's going to sign off on bank accounts, who is going to be issuing FAPIAOs because the invoice chop has to be placed on those, who's going to be dealing with import and export. Are you going to do it in-house? Are you going to outsource that to a freight forwarder? And then ultimately, who's going to be the legal rep chop? Who's going to have the legal rep chop? Which needs to be put on, is also potentially a bank signatory, and how is that going to be utilized? So, again, it's a balance, right? It's a balance about having corporate governance about all the day-to-day operations that are going to be occurring and trying to mitigate your risk. And don't forget, all of these things are adaptable, but you're hiring somebody due to COVID, you're hiring somebody you may never have met, because you want the business to get up and running and to scale. You think this person is qualified and is good, but you don't really know. You're required to place trust in them from day one, so otherwise the business won't scale up or even start. So how are you going to mitigate your risk by hiring somebody you don't know yet, you've only had Zoom calls with? As one client said to me a couple of months ago, we haven't even had a beer together, right? We haven't even had an after-work drink together. How are you going to mitigate your risk in case, he resigns during the probation period? Happens, guys, right? So what are you going to do? Or that you have to terminate him. So how are you going to mitigate your risks initially? And then as the trust develops over a 6-month, 12-month, 24-month period, where you can then adapt and give more control to the individual because you feel like they are stable within your company. So it's important to really analyze more the operation side of things than it is like who you're going to appoint. You have to know who's going to be actually functioning everything, which is why I've set up an action plan, which are really the questions to ask your management about the China operations. So again, who or what is making the investment? Is it a company or individual? Who are the decision makers, right? And what level of decisions can be made? Who's going to be the CFO, finance manager? Is this going to be someone from head office? Who's going to actually do the grunt work for the finance? Are you going to do it in-house, outsource? Who's going to be the bank signatory? Who or what will be the bank signatories? Because part of that are the chops, the finance chop. Who's approving payments? Who's going to have online access to the bank accounts? Who will keep control of the chops? Will you keep a logbook of the use of the chops? So it's really looking at, and then, I didn't even add here contracts. Who is in charge of contract formulation, negotiation, signing off on them, maintaining them, right? So it's really important to have what I believe is a solid articles of association. It is really important to have a simplified corporate structure, corporate management structure, with people that you feel are very stable. Remember, all of that can always be changed if necessary. To then think about operational guidelines, system processes, and to create then management directives that are together combined with employment agreements. I would love to hear what was your biggest takeaway from today. Please do let me know. Again, not so many people that are on here, and I saw that no questions have popped up. But how you can work with us in terms of the corporate management is we can appoint myself as a supervisor if you don't have enough people to appoint. We also offer non-executive director roles and responsibilities, which gives a broader picture onto the holistic point of view of the business versus just the finance aspect. And then we can give you advisory on who to appoint within the corporate management structure and advisory also on operational guidelines, management directives, etc. So let us know if you need help on that. And if you would like to book a strategy session with me, please do. The easiest way to reach out is at Christina@woodburnglobal.com, or you can book an appointment directly in my diary, as you wish. Again, no questions have popped up, so I'll just keep going. We have one last webinar, which we hosted tomorrow, on how to open your corporate bank account in China. And again, on that, I'll be looking very much on the operational side, the day-to-day running of your bank account in China and what you have to think about from that perspective. I hope this webinar was useful to you. And again, if you have any questions, do reach out and let me know. Take care and goodbye.